Roland, Charlemagne's last paladin, was the unbreakable shield of Christian Europe. His sword, Durandal, gleamed like a second sun as he single-handedly held back a 400,000-strong Saracen army. But this greatest myth of Christian chivalry is based on a lie. Roland was not killed by enemies of the faith. He was killed by his own people, Christians. On August 15, 778, in the Roncevaux Pass, a narrow forest trap, Charlemagne's rearguard was attacked not by Saracens, but by Basques. Einhard, the emperor's biographer, explicitly states this. There was no holy war. This transforms a great feat into a localized military disaster. And if the foundation of the legend is deception, what then is the truth about his glory? The first paradox arises, seemingly absurd. Why did Roland, possessing the oliphant horn, whose sound could have summoned Charlemagne's entire army to his aid, remain silent? He allowed the enemy to annihilate his entire detachment, even though salvation was just a breath away. And then there's the second, even deeper question. How did the humble Margrave Hruodland, Roland's real name, who lost this skirmish, achieve fame that eclipsed the emperor himself? Charlemagne ultimately won that war, but it was his fallen subordinate who remained in the memory of posterity. The answers to these questions are the keys to the blueprint for creating immortal heroes. By the end of this film, you will have 6 such keys. We won't just retell the legend, we will uncover its code so you can see it in any story. The name Roland is an access code to European culture, but his real name, Hruodland, has been virtually erased from history. The only clue we have is a single line in Einhard's Life of Charlemagne. According to it, Hruodland was the prefect of the Breton March. This was a border zone protecting the Franks from Celtic tribes, not from a global caliphate. He was not the emperor's right-hand man, but one of dozens of regional administrators. His death was such a mundane event that in a 15,000-word chronicle, Einhard dedicated only 19 words to it. That's less than 1,000th. His death was not a tragedy, but a statistic. So why did this insignificant defeat become the foundation for the greatest myth? To understand this, we need to uncover the true purpose of the Spanish campaign of 778. What compelled Charlemagne to cross the Pyrenees if not a holy war? The answer is prosaic. He was invited. Charlemagne intervened in the internal conflict of the Muslim emirs of Zaragoza at their own request. It was not a battle for faith, but a pragmatic attempt to expand his sphere of influence. But the adventure failed. Zaragoza could not be taken, allies betrayed him, and Charlemagne was forced to retreat in disgrace. To avoid returning empty-handed, his army plundered the Christian city of Pamplona on the way back. This is why the rearguard was attacked by Basques in the Roncevaux Pass. It was not a battle for Allah. It was Christian revenge for a plundered Christian city, and this revenge was made possible by one fatal tactical vulnerability of the Franks. How could elite heavy cavalry, the best army in Europe, be annihilated by lightly armed mountaineers without armor or horses? The Basques used their knowledge of the terrain. They set an ambush in the narrow gorge, attacking from above with stones and short spears, blocking the exit. The Franks' main advantage, their heavy armament, became their curse. In the confined space, the cavalry could not deploy for an attack, and their armor turned the warriors into cumbersome targets. The weight of a Frankish knight's armor and weapons reached 20 kilograms. A warrior who fell from his horse could not quickly get up on the rocky ground, becoming a helpless target. It was not a battle, but a systematic slaughter. The Franks lost not only men and honor, but also the entire baggage train with the gold looted in Spain. Someone had to quickly figure out how to transform this disgrace into an immortal feat. The picture of real events has been reconstructed. A real person, Hruodland, a border official. A real context, a failed political adventure. The real cause of death, a humiliating defeat at the hands of Christians, whom the Franks themselves provoked into revenge. This story is inglorious. And now the main question changes. Not what happened, but why was it necessary to conceal all this and invent a legend? We move from the archaeology of facts to the anatomy of propaganda. We will show how an unstable empire desperately needed a glue to hold its crumbling parts together, and how a dead, forgotten Hruodland became the ideal material for creating this glue. So why Hruodland? Dozens of Charlemagne's commanders died in battle. What made him, a loser, The ideal candidate for a hero? The answer, a political mandate. Charlemagne's empire was like a wall of irregularly shaped stones, laid without mortar. As long as Charlemagne the stonemason pressed down on it with his weight, it stood. But as soon as he was gone, the wall began to crumble. After his death, his sons and grandsons began to tear the empire apart. In this civil war, the idea of a vassal's absolute fealty to his lord became a matter of state survival. The first oral tales of Roland began to spread precisely during this period of disintegration, in the 9th century. This is no coincidence. But the main question remained, how to glorify a loser? All propaganda feeds on victories. How could a cult be built on the basis of an obvious defeat? The ingenious move of the myth's creators was to shift the focus. They understood, for the feudal aristocracy, a heroic death in battle for one's liege lord was valued higher than a tactical victory gained through cowardice. Honor was more precious than life. The myth of Roland is not about victory over an enemy. It is about victory over the main threat to feudalism, disloyalty. His death proved that loyalty was absolute. The myth established two new pillars of heroism, absolute loyalty and a glorious death. And to conceal the shame of defeat, in the Song of Roland, Charlemagne returns immediately after the hero's death. He takes revenge and achieves a crushing victory, embedding a personal tragedy into the ultimate triumph of the empire. Now put yourself in the shoes of an advisor to Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son. Your task is to create a myth that will strengthen a crumbling empire. On your desk are 3 dossiers. Fact number 1, 0 enemy cities captured. Fact number 2, 1 allied Christian city plundered. Fact number 3, 1 elite detachment annihilated. Which of these episodes would you choose to create a heroic legend? What quality of the hero would you emphasize to strengthen the emperor's power? This exercise shows the death of the rearguard is the only episode that could be turned into a story about loyalty, not about failure. What would you choose? So, there was a political mandate. But who was its executor? Who was the genius who transformed oral rumors into an immortal epic? We do not know his name. He is hidden behind the pseudonym Hruodland. But he was a brilliant political strategist who fulfilled the mandate 300 years after Hruodland's death. The Song of Roland was written around 1000 AD in a completely different world. This was the era of the Crusades, when the need for heroes fighting infidels reached its peak. 300 years is a chasm. For us, it's as if someone today wrote the first detailed history of events from the time of Ivan the Terrible, based only on rumors. The oral legend of the 9th century was just a draft. The real weapon was forged in the 11th. And now we will dissect the Song of Roland and examine the 3 main techniques that turned a local skirmish into a war of civilizations. The first technique, substitution of the enemy. Why did the author need to change the Basques to Saracens? The real enemy was inconvenient. By the 11th century, the Basques were no longer a threat, but the Islamic world had become Christianity's main adversary. The enemy was simply updated to the current version. But this was not just a replacement. It was the creation of an image of absolute evil. In the poem, 20,000 Franks fight against 400,000 Saracens. This monstrous hyperbole transforms Roland from a squad commander into a savior of humanity, standing in the path of an apocalyptic horde. To justify their annihilation, the Saracens are depicted as ridiculous pagans, worshipping a trinity of Apollo, Tervagant, and Muhammad. This is a deliberate distortion, turning them into non-humans, whom it is not regrettable to kill. Replacing the Basques with Saracens is like changing lenses. One showed a sharp but small picture of local revenge. The other created a grandiose panorama of a clash of civilizations. But even a 400,000-strong army could not defeat Roland without a stab in the back. The second technique, the introduction of a traitor. Why did the author need the fictional character Ganelon if there was no betrayal in reality? His appearance solves 2 problems at once. The first is dramatic. Ganelon, Roland's stepfather, transforms a military chronicle into a timeless tragedy of envy and family conflict. The second problem is political. Ganelon's betrayal completely absolves Charlemagne and his army of blame for the defeat. It wasn't the Franks who failed their reconnaissance. They weren't caught off guard. They were betrayed. It was a treacherous blow, not an honest defeat in battle. The myth of the imperial army's invincibility was saved. In the feudal world, a stepfather's betrayal was considered a crime not only against a person, but also against divine order, destroying the sacred bonds of family. But to create an ideal hero, it was not enough to change the plot. He needed to be given ideal weapons. The god. Third technique, the creation of sacred artifacts. In real chronicles, there is no mention of a magical sword or a miraculous horn. Where did Durendal and Oliphant come from in the poem? These are markers of chosenness. They transform Roland from a mere warrior into a superhuman. The hilt of his sword, Durendal, contains holy relics, a tooth of St. Peter and the blood of St. Basil. This turns Roland into a living relic, and his sword into a vessel for miracles. The artifacts become characters in their own right. Mortally wounded, Roland tries to smash Durendal against a rock so that it doesn't fall into enemy hands. The sword cleaves the rock but remains intact itself. It is an unbreakable symbol of faith. The legend claims that Durendal was forged by the same mythical smith who forged Excalibur. Thus, Roland was inscribed into the unified pantheon of Europe's greatest heroes. So, we have uncovered the three main mechanisms of falsification. The substitution of the enemy transformed a minor skirmish into a clash of worlds. A fictional traitor saved the reputation of an invincible army, and sacred artifacts endowed the hero with divine power. The literary construction of the myth is now completely clear. But how accurately did this brilliant picture correspond to how a Carolingian warrior actually looked and fought? Now we will conduct a military historical analysis. We will compare the mythical gleam of Durendal with the real steel of the 8th century. And finally, we will solve the main mystery. Why didn't Roland sound his horn? What did a warrior in Charlemagne's army actually look and fight like? He was not clad in shining plate armor like a knight from a movie. His armament was simpler, but deadlier. A long spathosword, a heavy spear for a charging blow, and a round wooden shield. Chainmail was a luxury, available only to a few of the highest nobility. Most went into battle in leather jackets and simple helmets without visors. But the main difference was in their riding posture. Charlemagne's cavalrymen did not yet have stirrups. This changes everything. Without firm foot support, the famous knightly lance charge, which channeled the entire mass of rider and horse, was impossible. It was like a boxer fighting on one leg. But the Frank's main weapon was not in his hands, but in his code of honor. It is this code that explains why Roland did not sound his horn, condemning 20,000 of the best warriors to death. This was not stupidity or hubris. This was the logic of the feudal world. For a warrior of that time, glory and honor were more important than life. To ask for help meant publicly admitting defeat, admitting incompetence. This was eternal shame for himself and his lineage. In the poem, his wise friend Olivier begs him to sound the horn to save his men. Roland refuses to save the honor of France. This is a dispute between two worlds, pragmatism and absolute duty. For Roland, honor was like a vessel, and life like water within it. To spill the water to save the vessel was valor. To break the vessel to save the water was unthinkable. And yet he does sound the horn. But too late. He does it when all are doomed. This is not a cry for help. It is a posthumous report from a vassal to his lord. The hero's death in the Song of Roland is a meticulously staged spectacle. He ascends a hill alone, lies beneath a pine tree facing enemy Spain. He tries to smash his sword against a rock, confesses his sins, and extends his right glove to God, like a vassal to his heavenly liege lord. Archangels descend for his soul. Now, reality. The real Hruodland died in a bloody slaughter. His death was the deafening crash of stones against shields, the cries of the wounded, pain, and a swift end under a hail of javelins. No beauty, no ritual silence. In the poem before his death, Roland lists all the lands he conquered for Charlemagne. This is the final report. The entire scene is an instruction on the ideal Christian death, and this ideal image led thousands of real people into battle. We have analyzed the real weapons, real tactics, and the code of honor that governed these men. We understand why Roland remained silent. All elements of the myth are now in place: historical basis, political mandate, literary elaboration, and psychological credibility. The construct is fully assembled and ready for use. It has ceased to be merely a story. It has become a weapon. And now we will see how the Song of Roland, which was read to knights before battle, became a real force. We will see how a dead paladin led living armies into the Crusades, where myth and reality finally merged. How could Ganelon, a respected baron and relative of the emperor, become the main traitor of France? This paradox defies all logic. He was not an outcast. He was part of the elite. In the poem, Roland nominates him for a deadly, dangerous mission as an envoy to the Saracens. For Ganelon, this is not just a political move, but a personal insult, a death sentence from his stepson. But it wasn't about simple revenge. For a warrior of that era, the concept of betraying the homeland didn't exist. His loyalty didn't work like air in a room, which everyone breathes, but like gravity. It drew him to a specific body, his liege lord Charlemagne, not to an abstract France. His revenge was directed only against Roland. The army's demise was merely a side effect. In his eyes, it was a restoration of honor, not treason. But why did the authors of the epic even need a traitor? Why couldn't they simply describe a heroic death in battle against a superior enemy? Because the real defeat at Roncevaux was a humiliating tactical failure. The historical Roland died at the hands of Christian Basques. His heavy cavalry was helpless in the narrow gorge, like a warship in a dried-up river. Without a traitor, this story is a tale of incompetence. Ganelon is an ingenious move that saves the honor of the army and the emperor. The defeat is explained not by the Franks' weakness, but by a treacherous stab in the back. This turns disgrace into tragedy. Remember how often in history defeat is explained precisely this way. Doesn't this technique seem familiar to you? The Carolingian chronicles are silent about Ganelon. In the life of Charlemagne, there is no mention of the man whose betrayal cost the emperor's nephew his life. The answer is simple. The historical Ganelon never existed. He is a purely literary construct, a function introduced to solve propaganda tasks. But this fictional character proved more influential than many real people. He became the eternal archetype of the traitor who broke his oath of fealty. The power of myth is such that fiction became fact in the minds of generations. For over 700 years, the name Ganelon became a byword in French, much like Judas in the Christian world. How did this story of family feud inspire nations to launch crusades? The drama of betrayal created a crystal-clear moral world, divided into black and white, into heroes and villains. This simplicity made the story an ideal template for any war propaganda. The myth of Ganelon worked like a sieve. It filtered out all the complex reality, tactical errors, an inconvenient enemy, the plundering of allies. Only two elements remained: pure heroism and absolute betrayal. This binary logic provided simple answers to complex war questions, removing any moral ambiguity. Now it was not just a tale, it was a weapon ready for battle, aimed at the Holy Land. How did a poem about a defeat at the hands of Christians in the 8th century become the main anthem for the wars for Jerusalem 300 years later? The fact defies logic. On the morning of October 14, 1066, before the Battle of Hastings, a knight named Taillefer rode before William the Conqueror's army. He tossed his sword in the air and sang the Song of Roland before charging into enemy ranks. At first glance, this is just a medieval soundtrack to boost morale, but the reality was grander. It was not just an anthem, but an ideological foundation that united thousands of knights from France, Germany, and Italy. Roland transformed from a national hero into a pan-Christian symbol. For the Crusaders, the capture of Jerusalem was not a new war. It was an act of vengeance for Roncevaux. What compelled them to abandon everything and embark on a deadly campaign? Why did Roland's story, rather than biblical narratives, become the main motivator? Its power lies in three elements. First, a clearly defined enemy, the infidel Saracens. Second, an ideal hero martyr, sacrificing himself for faith. Third, the idea of sacred vengeance, which justifies any violence. It seems like a fortunate coincidence of plot and political moment. But it's not a coincidence. It's a perfectly tuned ideological system. The song provided a ready-made worldview that answered all complex questions about plunder and murder. It switched off critical thinking, replacing it with one simple mission: to continue Roland's work. The most effective propaganda doesn't preach. It shapes reality. Pope Urban II, calling for the First Crusade, spoke the language of the epic, appealing to the same images of desecrated holy sites. But this myth proved so enduring that it outlived the Crusades themselves. It would seem that with their end, the legend should have died. How did the hero of a holy war find new life? First, in literature. In Ariosto's poem, Orlando Furioso, he transforms from a holy warrior into a half-mad lover. High tragedy became an adventure novel. But his image also penetrated politics. Statues of Roland in the market squares of German cities became symbols of urban freedoms, independence from feudal lords. The myth constantly adapted. 1,136 years after Roncevaux, in 1914, French soldiers received postcards depicting Roland piercing the Kaiser's eagle with his sword. The immortality of a myth lies in its ability to adapt. So, how did a dead paladin lead living soldiers into battle 3 centuries later? On the first level, we see how literature became a tool of politics. The Song of Roland is a classic example of how art can serve ideology. But there is a deeper level. Ultimately, the myth became stronger than its creators. It began to live its own life, transforming from a weapon into an eternal cultural code that adapted to the Renaissance, the struggle for urban liberties, and 20th century nationalism. The 10-meter statue of Roland in Bremen, erected in 1404, faces directly towards the church. It is a symbol of the city's independence from the archbishop's authority, not a war with infidels. We have traveled the entire path from human to weapon, and finally, to archetype. We have understood how the archetype was assembled. Now let's return to its beginning, to the historical dust. Hruodland's death was such an insignificant event that the empire's chroniclers barely noticed it. And it was this emptiness, this information vacuum, that made him ideal raw material for myth. The real story of Hruodland was like a dried-up riverbed. The event disappeared, but an ideal form remained, which politicians could fill with any water, any ideology they needed. The emptiness allowed everything to be inscribed into his image: absolute loyalty, religious fervor, readiness for self-sacrifice. Thus, we get the answer to the question of why him specifically. Because his real biography did not hinder the creation of an ideal legend. But a political mandate is dead without brilliant execution. It needs powerful emotional packaging. The Song of Roland became this packaging. 3 ingenious techniques were laid upon the foundation of imperial need. The replacement of the Basques with a 400,000-strong Saracen army transformed a local skirmish into an apocalypse. This was the entire population of Paris at that time, arranged in battle formation. The introduction of the traitor Ganelon turned a military failure into a personal tragedy. And the sacred artifacts, Durandal and Oliphant, transformed a simple warrior into a superhuman. Ideology becomes powerful only when it is told as a great story. If the political mandate created the hero's skeleton, the poem breathed a living soul into him. It was this soul that led armies. The ready, emotionally charged myth became the ideal weapon for the Crusades. It worked more effectively than any doctrine because it spoke the language of feelings, not reason. And here we resolve the main paradox: why a humble margrave eclipsed the emperor himself. The answer is simple. Charlemagne belongs to history and the state. Roland belongs to everyone. His story could be adopted by any knight, soldier, or citizen, which made it an infinitely more powerful tool for mobilization. We have seen the universal algorithm for creating a hero. It consists of 3 steps: historical vacuum, plus political necessity, plus artistic packaging. This algorithm works even today. The story of Roland is a mirror. It reflects the eternal technology of creating legends that move nations. It makes us feel 2 emotions simultaneously: admiration for the ideal of self-sacrifice, and extreme caution towards any heroic myth presented to us. Having traveled this entire path from an ambush in the mountains to the battlefields of World War I, who is Roland to you now? What outweighs the other in him? Write just 1 word in the comments, your personal verdict, hero or tool. There is no right answer. There is only your perspective after this investigation.